My heart pounded as Dad stood across the living room, glaring at me like I was a complete stranger. Moments earlier, he'd dropped the bombshell. Despite the $6,000 I'd been giving them every month, money I could barely spare, he wanted an extra $5,000 on top of that. When I hesitated, his fury was instant. I'd never seen my father so enraged, and I felt a trembling deep inside, like every memory of childhood warmth was being ripped away. I'd been helping my parents financially for 2 years now. I'm the eldest child, and my younger siblings were still in school. My parents, however, had grown used to my support. It had gone from heartfelt gratitude to an expectation, almost like a monthly tax I had no right to question. Tonight, the tension had erupted into something tangible and ugly. Dad's eyes were cold. I explained that I simply didn't have the extra money. My job, though good, was never meant to fund an entire household plus more. Yet he was convinced I was holding out on them. Then, without warning, he made the decision. Get out. His voice echoed in my ears. I froze, stunned, waiting for a punchline that never came. His final words before slamming the door behind me stung like betrayal. If you won't pay, you're not welcome here. And just like that, I found myself on the front porch, no longer a part of the place I once called home. I stood on the porch with a suitcase stuffed hastily with clothes. My father had thrust it into my arms and practically shoved me outside. The streetlights flickered in the darkness, casting weird shadows around me. The house that had been my sanctuary for so many years was suddenly hostile territory. My heart sank as I looked down at my phone, realizing I had just enough battery to search for a last-minute motel. I scrolled through contacts, considering calling a friend or two, but shame wrapped around my throat. How could I admit that I'd been kicked out by my own dad for not coughing up more money? It felt humiliating, like something out of a twisted drama. Still, my pride was overshadowed by panic. I needed a roof over my head for the night. I hopped into my car, a battered old sedan I'd paid off long ago, and fumbled to start it, my hands shaking. The interior smelled like leftover fast food wrappers and stale coffee. This was the same car I used every day to commute to the job that funded my parents' demands. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced back at the house, half expecting someone to run out, apologize, and say this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the windows remained dark. The door closed. It hurt more than words can describe. I drove into the night, confused and heartbroken, uncertain where to go or how this had all come to pass. I ended up in a tiny roadside motel with a flickering neon sign that buzzed loudly in the stillness. The clerk barely looked at me when I slid over my credit card. Once in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process the shock. Less than an hour ago, I was living under my parents' roof, diligently paying them $6,000 a month. Then, the demand for another $5,000 came. I refused, and I was shown the door as if I was a disobedient child. A swirl of emotions threatened to overwhelm me. I felt angry, furious even, yet heartbreak tangled with that rage. How could my own parents treat me like an ATM? I flashed back to countless evenings when Mom would praise me for my hard work, Dad would pat my back for landing a solid job. Had all of that been an act to keep me giving? I took a deep breath, trying to slow my racing thoughts. Even though I was hurt, I couldn't help but yearn for some sort of resolution. I loved my family, and the idea that money had come between us was gut-wrenching. Before I collapsed into a troubled sleep, a single haunting thought gnawed at my mind. Would they even care that I was gone? The next morning, I woke to the harsh beep of my phone's alarm, an unwelcome reminder that life goes on even when your world feels like it's crumbling. My neck ached from the lumpy motel pillow, and I had to be at work soon. As I dressed, I kept replaying the previous night in my head, hoping the shock would wear off, but it didn't. I arrived at the office feeling like a ghost. My coworkers asked if everything was okay. I forced a shaky smile. I couldn't tell them the truth yet. Instead, I locked myself in a stall in the restroom during lunch and stared at my reflection in the mirror, searching for answers in the bags under my eyes. My phone buzzed, a text from Mom. My heart jolted. Maybe she was worried. Her message read, "We need the extra $5,000, or we can't manage. You have to understand." I stared at it, my hands trembling. There was no mention of the eviction, no apology, no softness, just the same demand. I typed back, I'm sorry, but I simply can't. I'm barely affording the $6,000 as it is. I'm trying. Silence followed. No response. The weight of that short text exchange crushed me, shattering any hope that last night was just a misunderstanding. All day, I wrestled with a sense of betrayal. Memories from my childhood kept invading my thoughts. Dad teaching me to ride a bike, Mom cheering me on during my school plays. I grew up feeling loved and supported, and in return, I wanted to help them in their retirement years. But now, everything felt twisted. Still, I couldn't banish the nagging guilt. Was I, in some way, to blame? Could I have handled things differently? That question tormented me, because I never wanted to be the kid who turned his back on his parents. A few days later, I mustered the courage to call them, hoping the heat of the argument had cooled. I dialed my home number, my childhood phone line, and waited, heart pounding, as it rang. Finally, my father answered. Without even a greeting, he started berating me for abandoning them in their time of need. He accused me of having no respect, of forgetting my roots. Anger welled up, hot and raw, but I tried to remain calm. Dad, I'm still giving you $6,000 a month. That's not a small amount. I don't have more to give. He scoffed, told me not to bother coming back until I was ready to pay my fair share, and hung up. The line went dead, and so did my last sliver of hope for immediate reconciliation. In the following weeks, my motel stay stretched into an uncomfortable normal. Financial stress worsened, as my budget had never accounted for sudden rent, plus the continued $6,000 I was still automatically transferring to my parents. I hadn't stopped those payments yet because the idea of cutting them off felt too final, like burning a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to destroy. Every day I wrestled with the same painful question. Should I keep paying? Part of me felt obligated. Another part of me screamed that I was being used. My exhaustion was more than physical, it was emotional. Work suffered, and my boss pulled me aside, asking if something was going on. I lied, saying it was just a bad cold. Meanwhile, my mother texted occasionally, each time with the same message. When can you give the extra money? I tried calling her back to talk things through, but she never picked up. It felt as if my parents were speaking to me in a language of cold demands, ignoring the turmoil it caused. One night, I just sank onto the motel bed, tears slipping down my face. I never imagined my own family could make me feel so lonely, so expendable. But that pain was about to transform into a new kind of resolve. Desperation drove me to an uncomfortable decision. I visited the bank to discuss my financial obligations. The teller recognized my stressed demeanor and ushered me to a private cubicle with a sympathetic smile. I explained my monthly payments and asked if there was any way to restructure my finances, maybe a small personal loan to carry me until I found cheaper lodging. The advisor's eyes widened when I mentioned $6,000 a month going to my parents. She tried to mask her surprise, but I could see the shock ripple across her face. I left the bank with heavy feet. No matter how I spun it, continuing to funnel that money was unsustainable. Yet guilt clung to me like a dark shadow. What if my parents truly needed it? I imagined them struggling to pay their bills without my support. But then I recalled Dad's wrathful glare. I replayed the moment he ordered me out. I remembered Mom's cold texts. These weren't the actions of people who treasured me. It was all about the money. Staring at my phone, I debated sending them another message, pleading for understanding. But something in me shifted. A seed of quiet resolve planted itself. I refused to keep living as their doormat. I attempted one last, face-to-face meeting at a local cafe. Neutral ground. I texted Mom and Dad, requesting we discuss things properly. They reluctantly agreed to come. My stomach flipped as I waited at a corner table, fiddling with my coffee cup. They arrived together, stony-faced. Dad barely made eye contact, and Mom's lips were pressed into a thin line. I began softly, I love you both, and I want to help. But I can't give you more than I have. $6,000 a month is all I can manage. Can we talk about your expenses? Maybe there's a way to budget. Dad cut me off with a sharp laugh. That's none of your business. You're doing well, and we're your parents. You owe us. My breath caught in my throat. Mom glanced at me, her expression tinged with something I couldn't decipher. Pity? Fear? Shame? But she said nothing. I pressed on, though my voice trembled. I'm out of the house now. I'm paying rent. I just want to find a compromise. Dad pounded his fist on the table, causing heads to turn. "Stop being selfish," he growled. Then he stormed out, leaving me and Mom behind. She followed, but not before whispering, "If you loved us, you'd do whatever we ask." I was left alone at the cafe, the coffee growing cold in my hands. Their words kept echoing long after the cafe confrontation. My father's furious outburst, my mother's guilt-laden whisper. I was tired of feeling cornered, tired of being cast as the villain, tired of sacrificing my own life to meet their unending demands. That night in the motel, I lay awake, staring at the peel-in wallpaper, and made a decision. I had to protect myself. The realization sparked a flicker of resolve in my chest. If they wanted to see me as the ungrateful child, then so be it, but I would no longer be their cash cow. I first considered cutting off the funds entirely, but something told me to be more strategic. I needed to learn exactly where all that money was going. Was it medical bills? Gambling? Lavish indulgences? The fact that they never opened up about their finances fueled my suspicion, so I started digging quietly. I combed through old transaction records, sifting for any clue about their spending. My father had never been transparent, and now it felt imperative to unveil the truth. With each page I flipped, my indignation grew. They had taught me to value hard work, to take responsibility for my own life. Yet they seemed to believe they were entitled to mine. I decided then I would gather every piece of evidence about their misuse of my money. And when the time was right, I'd reveal it all. Every evening after work, I'd return to the motel and submerge myself in detective work. My eyes blurred from staring at spreadsheets, bank statements, and digital receipts. I had to be discreet because I knew any sign of me prying into their finances would set them off. I started noticing patterns. They were spending thousands each month on luxuries, fancy dinners, random splurges, big-ticket items like a home theater system, all under my nose. There were also unexplained wire transfers. My blood boiled as I uncovered each indulgent expense. At the same time, I was careful to maintain the monthly $6,000 payment. I wanted to keep them complacent, unsuspecting. If I abruptly cut them off, they'd come at me full force. No, I needed them comfortable enough to keep revealing their habits. Late one night, I found a record of a recent vacation they'd taken, an extravagant cruise that cost a small fortune. According to the dates, it was right after Dad told me they were struggling with bills. My hands shook with anger. I began documenting everything meticulously, each expense carefully cataloged. Soon, I had a trove of evidence that painted a picture of greed, manipulation, and deceit. They had lied to me, and that betrayal stoked my determination to take control of my life again. The more I uncovered, the more a plan formed in my mind. I wanted something that would not only free me from their grasp, but also teach them a lesson. Yet I wrestled with guilt. I still loved them, no matter how they treated me. But love shouldn't be a license for them to abuse my trust. I considered hiring a lawyer to handle any legal fallout, but I needed something more personal, a confrontation that would force them to face the truth in front of people they respected. I wanted them to understand that their actions had consequences, that I wasn't just an unfeeling wallet. In the meantime, I pretended everything was normal, or as normal as it could be. I sent the monthly payment on time, never missed a single day of work, and avoided direct contact with my parents. They seemed to take my silence as compliance, likely thinking I was learning my lesson. Inside, I was steeling myself. With every passing hour, I grew sure that I had to see this plan through. If I didn't, they would devour my future. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about standing up for myself, about reclaiming my dignity. And so I kept compiling evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A small victory came unexpectedly. One afternoon, my aunt, Dad's sister, called me. She lived out of state and rarely reached out, so my guard went up. "Hey," she said, voice tense. "I just heard about you moving out. Is everything okay?" I hesitated, not sure how much to reveal. But something about her concerned tone disarmed me. So I shared just enough, that I was kicked out for not paying an extra $5,000 a month. Aunt Mary gasped. "They told me you left on your own and refused to give them a dime." My heart sank. So they were spinning lies within the family too. I explained my side in a calm, measured way, and I could practically hear Aunt Mary's anger simmering. She'd suspected something was off. Apparently, Dad had been bragging about new purchases. Aunt Mary said she supported me, and if I needed anything, financial help, a place to stay, she was there. Relief washed over me. Finally, someone in the family was on my side. "I might need your help soon," I told her, voice trembling with gratitude. She didn't hesitate. "Anything you need, I've got your back." For the first time since being kicked out, I felt a glimmer of warmth. And I wondered if this conversation might play a role in the plan I was piecing together. Encouraged by Aunt Mary's support, I decided to widen my net. I discreetly reached out to a couple of cousins I trusted, testing the waters to see who else might believe me and not blindly side with my parents. It turned out, many were shocked to learn that I'd been paying such a colossal sum every month. Some were horrified at how my parents had demanded even more. One cousin confided that Dad had mentioned I was too busy living some fancy lifestyle to care about family. I nearly laughed at the absurdity. I was holed up in a tiny motel room, scraping by to fulfill their demands, while they were the ones living it up. Word spread quietly among a few more relatives. With each conversation, I felt my resolve crystallize. I realized that a direct confrontation with my parents alone wouldn't be enough. They would twist the story. I needed something public, something that would make it impossible for them to spin lies. It struck me that a family gathering was coming up, the annual reunion. Typically, it was a big, chaotic event, and I'd been dreading it in light of recent events. But now I saw an opportunity. If I played my cards right, I could present the truth in a setting where my parents couldn't hide. My plan's shape became clearer. Gather the evidence, gather the witnesses, and let the truth explode in a place they least expected. With the family reunion only a month away, I poured every spare moment into perfecting my strategy. I knew my parents would attend. They never missed these gatherings, partly because they loved keeping up appearances. This time, their facade would crack in front of everyone. At work, I stayed late to use the office scanner and make neat digital copies of the bank statements and receipts. I organized them in a folder on my laptop, complete with clear labels and notes. If I was going to expose them, I wanted it to be undeniable. Though every step fueled me with determination, a pang of sorrow haunted me. These were my parents, the people who'd raised me. I kept recalling their kindness from my childhood, the times we laughed together. It felt surreal that I was about to publicly confront them. But every time I wavered, I remembered my dingy motel room and how they'd locked me out of home and heart without a shred of remorse. I reached out to Aunt Mary again, letting her know part of my plan. She supported me wholeheartedly, promising to stand by me if things got heated. "They need a dose of reality," she said bluntly. Her conviction bolstered mine. I was readying for the storm. All I had to do now was wait and make sure my parents never suspected a thing. The final week before the reunion was excruciating. I forced myself to keep paying the monthly $6,000, though it burned me every time I hit the send button. But I needed them to believe everything was normal, that I'd accepted their terms. I avoided direct contact, aside from a single text to Mom saying I'd see them at the reunion. Her response was unusually pleasant. "We'll be there. Don't be late." It made my skin crawl, knowing they were pretending everything was fine. Each night, I rehearsed how I would present my evidence. Would I confront them in front of everyone in one dramatic reveal, or should I pull them aside first for a private talk? But no, that would only give them a chance to manipulate the narrative. I needed to ensure no cover-ups. My stomach twisted at the thought of potential outcomes. They could disown me completely, or scream and storm out, or even turn physically aggressive. But I steeled my nerves. This was bigger than fear. I deserved to reclaim my autonomy and let everyone see the truth. When I finally packed my car to head to the reunion, a calm determination settled over me. Ready or not, this was the moment I'd been planning for. And something deep inside told me I was doing the right thing. The family reunion took place at a large rented lodge by a lake. Everyone milling around, kids racing on the grass, uncles and aunts greeting each other with hearty hugs. I arrived early, laptop bag in tow, tension coiling inside me like a spring. Dad and Mom showed up a little later, laughing loudly with relatives. Their eyes slid over me without a trace of guilt, as if nothing had happened. I caught Aunt Mary's glance. She gave me a subtle nod, confirming she had my back. We all gathered in the big living room for a family update session, a tradition where each household shared their news. My palms sweated as I waited for the perfect opening. When it was my turn, I stood. "I have something important to share," I said, voice trembling slightly. Dad's face darkened with suspicion. Mom looked uneasy. I connected my laptop to the large screen, heart hammering. I spoke calmly. "Over the last 2 years, I've been giving my parents $6,000 monthly to help with expenses. Recently, they demanded an additional $5,000, and when I couldn't afford it, they kicked me out." Gasps rippled through the room. My parents erupted in protest, but I raised my hand to show them the evidence. Click. Images of their extravagant purchases, the cruise receipts, the home theater. The hush in the room was deafening, as each slide revealed spending that clearly went beyond basic needs. Dad tried to shout me down, but Aunt Mary stood, glaring at him. "Let the truth be heard," she said firmly. Shock registered on the faces of uncles, aunts, and cousins. Some stared at Dad and Mom in disbelief. Others whispered among themselves, scandalized. I pressed forward with my presentation, forcing my voice to remain steady. I explained how I'd sacrificed my own comfort, living in a motel just to keep up with their financial demands. How each time they'd claim dire need, the money actually went to luxuries. How they'd lied to extended family, saying I abandoned them. "You ungrateful child," Dad finally thundered, face flushed. "How dare you put our private information out there like this?" My heart pounded, but I refused to back down. "I did what I had to. You kicked me out of our home, you demanded more than I could give, and you lied about it." Mom burst into tears, trying to paint me as cruel, but Aunt Mary wasn't swayed. She recounted how my parents had boasted about their new gadgets, vacations, and parties behind my back. That left Mom and Dad scrambling for an explanation. Soon, several relatives confronted them. One uncle spat, "How could you treat your own child this way?" My parents stumbled over excuses, claiming they deserved the money for raising me, but the room had turned against them. I stood there, a storm of emotions swirling, anger, sadness, relief. The confrontation had begun, and there was no turning back. As the tension in the room peaked, Dad lunged toward my laptop. Instinctively, I yanked it back, terrified he might try to destroy the evidence. Aunt Mary stepped between us, warning him to calm down. His eyes were wild, filled with a rage I'd never witnessed in him before. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years started scolding my parents, appalled at their behavior. I almost felt sorry for Mom, who was sobbing into her hands, but I remembered the cold texts and manipulations. The part of me that cared still hurt, but the part that had been humiliated and used felt vindicated. "I did everything I could to support you," I told them, my voice wavering. "But you demanded more. You threatened me and you kicked me out. I'm done being your doormat." Dad bellowed that I was betraying the family, that I owed them for my upbringing. But the words rang hollow in the face of the evidence displayed for everyone to see. Slowly, the room quieted. Relatives turned away from my parents, shaking their heads in disgust. Though the confrontation was chaotic, I sensed the tables had turned. My parents' longtime narrative of me being the distant, selfish child was unraveling in real time. The truth was laid bare, and they were left with nothing but their own exposed greed. Somehow, the weight of years of tension lifted off my shoulders. I felt an unexpected calm as I stared at my father's outraged face. Mom's tears had subsided into shaky sniffles. Everyone else stood in a thick hush, uncertain what might happen next. I closed my laptop slowly. "As of this moment, I'm cutting off the monthly payments. I'll no longer be manipulated," I announced. The words felt foreign on my tongue, but in a liberating way. A few relatives nodded in approval. Dad opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Mom's gaze darted around, perhaps searching for a single ally in the crowd. No one came forward. The look of betrayal in her eyes was different this time, like she realized how deeply they'd cornered themselves. I took a steadying breath and addressed the room. "I'm sorry for bringing drama to the reunion, but I needed you all to know the truth. I've been labeled as ungrateful, but you can see I tried. I'm not paying another cent, and I won't apologize for protecting myself." Aunt Mary placed a hand on my shoulder. The silence broke with murmurs of understanding. My parents, on the other hand, stood isolated, like pillars of misplaced pride. I could see the shock in their eyes. They'd never imagined this outcome. That evening, as people began dispersing, I left the lodge feeling drained but oddly victorious. My aunt walked me out, confirming she'd help me find a better living situation. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice gentle. "They need to learn actions have consequences." A few family members who'd witnessed the confrontation approached, offering support. Their empathy was like a balm to my raw emotions. One cousin even handed me a business card of a property manager friend, promising to help me find an affordable apartment. Mom and Dad lingered at a distance, avoiding eye contact. For a moment I almost wished Dad would come over and apologize. But he didn't. The entire day had unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck, and I doubted they knew how to pick up the pieces. As I drove away, I replayed the highlight, standing up for myself in front of everyone, unveiling the truth they'd tried so hard to bury. This was the payoff of my secret plan, my methodical evidence gathering, my willingness to endure a public scene. And though I felt a pang of sadness, I was proud. I'd been forced into this corner, but now I was free. The question that lingered was how my parents would handle the aftermath. They'd never been so thoroughly exposed before. The fallout was immediate. In the days following the reunion, news traveled through the family's grapevine faster than I could imagine. People called and texted me, expressing shock at my parents' behavior. My father's once proud reputation took a serious hit. Some of his old friends, upon hearing the story, distanced themselves. Meanwhile, my aunt convinced me to move into her guest room temporarily. I packed up my motel belongings and moved into a space that felt safe and warm for the first time in months. Just being in a normal house, not alone in a rundown motel, lifted a burden off my shoulders. I heard whispers that my parents were furious with me, complaining to anyone who would listen, that I'd aired our dirty laundry. But oddly enough, few sympathized with them after seeing the evidence. Even those who wanted to remain neutral couldn't deny that what my parents did was exploitative. I half expected Dad to show up at Aunt Mary's doorstep, banging on the door to confront me again. But he never did. Maybe he realized any further outburst would only make him look worse. I found a glimmer of relief in that, though a part of me still ached for the warmth of a normal parent-child relationship. In the following week, a surprising phone call came from Mom. My chest tightened when I saw her name on the screen. Against my better judgment, I picked up, heart racing. "I don't know what to say anymore," she murmured softly. She sounded tired, not quite apologetic, but definitely humbled. "Your father won't talk about it, but he's different. He's quieter now." I said nothing, letting her speak. She sighed. "We're having trouble with the mortgage payments, and with Dad's friends pulling away, he's stressed." I waited, bracing for the inevitable plea for money. But it didn't come, at least not directly. She added, "I just wanted you to know." An odd mix of emotions churned inside me. Sympathy stirred for her anxiety, but I couldn't forget the betrayal. "Mom, I'm sorry you're going through that, but I can't keep supporting your lifestyle. If you truly need financial help, maybe we can talk about a structured budget, or..." She cut in, voice cracking. "No, Dad would never accept that. He'd see it as another insult." Her words hung in the air, thick with tension. Then, in a quieter tone, she said, "I never wanted it to come to this." I swallowed hard. "You both made choices, Mom, and so did I." She didn't argue. Instead, she ended the call with a heavy sigh, leaving me with a faint sense of her regret, and a lingering ache that still, she offered no real apology. After Mom's call, I realized the cracks in their world were more substantial than I'd imagined. With their reckless spending exposed, social support dwindling, and Dad's pride bruised, they found themselves cornered. It was a bitter outcome, but it was also the direct result of their choices. Aunt Mary noticed I was restless. "You're better off focusing on your own future," she advised gently. "They need to learn to stand on their own feet. You have a life to build." So I took her advice to heart. I threw myself into work, determined to climb out of the financial mess I'd inherited. Freed from that crushing $6,000 monthly weight, I felt like I could finally breathe. My boss noticed the shift in my energy, praising my renewed focus. Meanwhile, my parents faced real bills without my inflow of cash. If they truly needed help, they would have to lower their expenses or seek outside assistance. It wasn't my responsibility to fund their every desire anymore. As time passed, the drama began to settle. Relatives moved on to other topics. The spotlight on my parents' greed eventually dimmed, leaving a sense of awkward quiet between us. A part of me longed for closure, or at least a conversation that ended with a real apology or acceptance. But that closure would come in a way I never expected. A few months later, word reached me that my parents were on the brink of losing the house. Their high mortgage payments, combined with a downturn in Dad's pension investments, had left them scrambling. I felt a pang of concern, but also a cold reminder of how they'd once thrown me out without hesitation. Aunt Mary told me Dad was considering selling the house altogether. It felt surreal. This was my childhood home, the place I'd grown up in. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of the porch that night, the way the door slammed in my face. At work one afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. My father. He stood awkwardly in the lobby, shoulders sagging with an uncharacteristic vulnerability. He asked to speak with me privately. My heart thudded with a mix of anger and pity. We stepped into a quiet corner. Dad cleared his throat, eyes darting from me to the floor. I want to say I'm sorry, he managed, voice trembling. Things got out of hand. We lost perspective. I stared, stunned by the admission. It wasn't the elaborate apology I'd yearned for, but it was something. Dad, do you realize how badly you hurt me? I asked softly, tears pricking my eyes. He nodded, lips pressed tight. Yes, he whispered, but it's too late to fix, isn't it? I didn't have an answer yet, but in that moment I saw a flicker of remorse in my father's eyes, and it almost melted the anger I'd been harboring. Almost. After Dad's quiet apology, we had a painful, halting conversation. He asked if there was any chance I'd come back home, but I knew that wasn't the right step for me. My trust in them, in our old family dynamic, was too damaged. Instead, I offered that if they were truly willing to change, we could work on rebuilding a relationship slowly. No money involved, just genuine effort on both sides. In the months that followed, they did lose the house, downsizing to a smaller place. It was a humbling experience for them. For me, it was bittersweet. That home held so many memories, good and bad. But there was no turning back the clock. Gradually, I found myself focusing on my own life, saving for a house of my own, finding a healthier emotional balance, and even exploring a new relationship that blossomed as I learned how to love without the baggage of my family's toxic expectations. Over time, Dad and I exchanged more calls, sometimes tense, sometimes surprisingly compassionate. Mom was more cautious, still weighed down by guilt. But slowly, step by step, we started piecing together a new kind of connection, one built on honesty, not obligation. The moral of this painful journey is clear. You can love your family and still refuse to be their victim. Standing up for yourself isn't selfish. Sometimes, it's survival. And if they truly love you in return, eventually they'll come to understand. Sometimes, it takes losing everything you thought you had to finally find the freedom and self-respect you truly deserve.